I want you to just try to put yourself in a very specific and honestly incredibly uncomfortable situation for a second.
Okay, lay it on me.
So it is 1898. You are deep inside the steel belly of a 14,000-ton United States battleship called the Oregon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and you are anchored off the coast of San Francisco, just looking out at the Pacific Ocean. And suddenly a telegraph order comes down that just changes absolutely everything. War with Spain is inevitable, and your ship is needed in the Caribbean, like, immediately.
Right, but there's a huge geographical problem there.
A massive one, because there is no Panama Canal yet. So to get from the West Coast to the East Coast, the Oregon has to sail south. And I don't mean just, down to Mexico.
Right.
I mean all the way down the entire jagged length of the Americas. You have to navigate the famously treacherous Strait of Magellan at the very freezing tip of South America, and then turn around to steam all the way back north up the Atlantic. It's a 15,000-mile ocean sprint.
Which is just a mind-boggling distance for a steamship of that era to try and do in a hurry.
Exactly. And for 66 breathless, completely exhausting days, the ship just pushes its engines to the absolute breaking point. I mean, down in the boiler rooms, the temperatures are hovering around 160 degrees Fahrenheit.
That is just brutal.
It's insane. The crew is quite literally shoveling coal, like their lives depend on it, covered in black dust, completely cut off from the world. Meanwhile, the American public back home is reading about this in the newspapers, completely terrified that this lone battleship is going to round a cape and just run headfirst into the entire Spanish fleet.
Yeah, it was a massive media spectacle at the time.
It really was. And when the Oregon finally limps into the Caribbean, it sparks this profound paradigm-shifting realization in Washington. The world has gotten way too dangerous, and the United States' front door and back door are basically a 2-month walk apart.
A completely unacceptable strategic vulnerability.
Right. So why am I telling you about a sweaty, desperate naval voyage from the 19th century? Well, because the answer to what happened next is actually the key to unlocking a massive cultural paradox. What does that 66-day journey in 1898 have to do with James Cameron's three-dimensional blue aliens in the 2009 blockbuster film Avatar?
I mean, it sounds like a completely ridiculous comparison on its face, right? But the through line is actually incredibly direct, and honestly, it's a bit unsettling once you really see it.
Welcome to the Doctrine Deep Dive. Our mission for this deep dive into the source material today is to unpack a profoundly complex legacy. We're going to look at the history of United States military intervention and imperial expansion in Latin America.
But we aren't just stopping at the history, are we?
No, definitely not. We are going to examine exactly how that physical, historical reality, the military doctrine, the resource extraction, how all of that morphed over a century into the neo-colonial cultural and environmental narratives that you and I consume in Hollywood today.
Yeah, we are basically tracing a path from the deployment of Marines securing train tracks in the jungle all the way to the deployment of cinematic narratives securing our emotional comfort in a modern movie theater.
It's fascinating stuff. And to guide us, we have a really fantastic stack of sources to go through. We are drawing heavily from historical excerpts of the book The Banana Wars by Ivan Musicant.
Excellent book.
Yeah, it's great. And for the cultural shift, we have 2 really dense, really fascinating academic articles. One is Avatar and the Movements of Neocolonial Sentimental Cinema by Kyla Schuller, and the other is Avatar and the Amazon, Narratives of Cultural Conversion by John Adamark.
Both of those really dig into the media theory side of things.
You do. And finally, we are bringing in a piece from The Guardian titled, From Tarzan to Avatar, The Problem with the White Man in the Jungle.
So it's a very diverse stack of materials, bringing military history and media theory right together. But to really understand the media theory, you kind of have to understand the geography first.
Absolutely. So let's jump back to that battleship. The Oregon finally arrives, the Spanish-American War happens, and the United States wins. And by the end of 1898, the United States has accidentally acquired this sprawling empire. I mean, the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and heavy influence over Cuba.
Right. The United States is suddenly a global power with a 2-ocean navy. But, as we just talked about, that navy is hopelessly divided by the massive, solid landmass of the Americas.
Yeah, a huge physical obstacle.
Exactly. The voyage of the Oregon basically proved to military and political leaders that a trans-Isthmian canal, a waterway cutting straight through Central America, was no longer just some commercial pipe dream for shipping companies to make a quick buck.
Right, it was about survival.
Exactly. It was an absolute non-negotiable necessity for national defense. If a canal had been in place, the Oregon could have cut her travel time by 2/3. So the political will to build this canal just became an overwhelming, unstoppable force in Washington.
But the location wasn't obvious, right? Yeah. Because Musicant's text points out that Panama was actually not the first choice at all. Everyone in Washington was looking at Nicaragua.
Yes. There was this group called the Walker Commission, and they were tasked by the United States government with figuring out the absolute best route. And they originally recommended Nicaragua.
Which makes sense geographically, right?
It did. It made a lot of sense. The route was significantly closer to United States ports in the Gulf of Mexico. The climate there was considered much healthier, which, was a massive deal back then when you're talking about tropical diseases.
For sure.
And crucially, Nicaragua has this massive inland body of water, Lake Nicaragua. So engineers figured they could just use the lake to do a lot of the heavy lifting for the transit.
Just sail right over it.
Right. It would drastically reduce the amount of actual digging they had to do.
Plus, Panama had some terrible public relations going for it at the time. I mean, the French had already tried to build a canal there in the 1880s, led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, the really famous engineer who built the Suez Canal. And it was just a legendary catastrophe.
Oh, a total disaster. The French effort in Panama was marred by massive bankruptcies, incredible financial corruption scandals back in Paris, and just horrific, devastating losses to yellow fever and malaria.
The jungle basically ate them alive.
He completely defeated them.
Yeah.
So the United States looked at Panama as this graveyard for ambition. Nicaragua really seemed like the safe, smart choice.
Which brings us to one of the most wild, almost unbelievable lobbying efforts in all of political history. Enter a French engineer named Philippe Boulainville.
Boulainville is one of those historical figures who almost feels like a fiction character. He had been an engineer on that failed French Panama project.
All right.
And when the original French company went bankrupt, a new company was formed to just take over the remaining assets. The rusting equipment, the excavated dirt, the land rights.
Whatever was left.
Yeah. And Boulainville was a major stockholder in this new, essentially worthless company. So he desperately needed a buyer to recoup his money. And the only potential buyer on Earth with the capital to actually finish the job was the United States government.
So his entire personal fortune basically depends on convincing the United States to abandon the safe, recommended Nicaragua route and buy his rusty French equipment in Panama instead.
Exactly.
How on earth does he pull that off? I mean, that sounds impossible.
He essentially runs a one-man, highly sophisticated psychological operation on the United States Congress.
Oh.
Yeah, he moves into the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York and just begins tirelessly lobbying politicians. And his main angle of attack is geology.
Geology?
Yeah, he starts arguing that Nicaragua is seismically unstable, that it's this land of earthquakes and volcanoes, and that building a delicate lock and dam system there is a complete fool's errand.
But just telling people about volcanoes isn't going to sway a massive government commission that has already made up its mind, is it?
No, he needed proof. And his masterstroke happened right before the crucial vote in the United States Senate on the Spooner Amendment, which was the legislation that would officially decide the canal route.
Okay.
Boulainville is desperate. And then he finds out something incredible. Nicaragua had recently issued a postage stamp featuring the Momotombo volcano. And on the stamp, the volcano is visibly erupting.
Wait, you cannot write this stuff. A country that is actively trying to convince the world it is geographically stable puts an erupting volcano on its own official mail.
Exactly. It's bonkers. So Boulainville rushes around Washington, visiting every stamp dealer he can possibly find, and buys up an entire collection of these Momotombo stamps. He meticulously mounts each stamp on a piece of paper and sends one to every single senator with a letter.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. The subtext of the letter was essentially, don't listen to me. Look at what the Nicaraguans choose for their own national coat of arms, an erupting volcano. Are you really going to risk American lives and millions of dollars building a canal right under an active volcano?
And according to the sources, it actually works. It genuinely terrifies Congress enough that they abandoned the Nicaraguan route and shift the legislation to authorize the canal in Panama instead.
It was incredibly effective.
But as soon as they make that decision, they run into a massive geopolitical brick wall. Because Panama is not an independent country at this point. It is a province, a department of the sovereign nation of Colombia.
Right. And Colombia is fully aware of how valuable this land suddenly is. The United States drafts a treaty with a Colombian representative in Washington, the Hay-Huron Treaty.
Okay.
It would have given the United States a lease on a canal zone across the isthmus. But when the treaty goes back to Bogota, the Colombian Senate rejects it outright.
Why? Were they just, holding out for more money?
Well, money was certainly a factor. They definitely felt the financial compensation the United States offered was insultingly low compared to the massive revenue the canal would eventually generate. But beyond that, the sources indicate it was a profound issue of national sovereignty. The Colombian Senate felt that signing away a strip of their country to a foreign power in perpetuity was unconstitutional and just a massive violation of their national integrity.
So Colombia says no. The legal diplomatic route is totally dead, which means Bunavarilla's shares are about to become worthless all over again. So what does he do?
He decides that if Colombia won't sign the treaty, he needs to deal with a country that will. So he decides to basically invent a new country.
Just indent one.
Yep. From his suite room 1162 at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, a room he later very dramatically called the cradle of the Panama Republic, he orchestrates a revolution.
Okay, walk me through the actual mechanics of that, because how does a French guy sitting in a New York hotel start a revolution in Central America?
Well, he finds out there is already a faction of Panamanian dissidents who have harbored separatist tendencies from Colombia for years. They're led by a man named Dr. Manuel Amador Guerrero. So Bunavarilla meets with him secretly in New York. Bunavarilla leverages his Wall Street connections to secure loans to fund the rebellion, literally providing the hard cash needed to bribe the local Colombian garrison in Panama not to fight.
Wow.
He drafts a Declaration of Independence. He actually has his wife sew the first prototype of the new Panamanian flag right there in the hotel room.
But, a flag and some Wall Street cash aren't going to stop the entire Colombian army from just marching up the isthmus and crushing this tiny rebellion. They needed serious military backing.
Yeah.
Did the United States explicitly tell Bunavarilla they would provide military support?
Explicitly, no. President Theodore Roosevelt was a very shrewd politician. He was furious with Colombia for rejecting the treaty, but he was very careful not to leave a paper trail ordering a revolution in a sovereign nation.
Plausible deniability.
Exactly. However, tacitly, the message was crystal clear. Bunavarilla assured the Panamanian rebels that the United States Navy would be there to protect them. And sure enough, as the date of the planned rebellion approached in November of 1903, President Roosevelt ordered United States naval ships, including the Nashville and the Dixie, to steam toward the coast of Panama.
So the rebels declare independence. Colombia immediately tries to send reinforcements by sea to put down the rebellion. And what happens when they actually arrive?
They are met by the United States Navy, and here is where the legal gymnastics become truly staggering, according to the sources.
Yeah, this part is wild.
The commanders of the American ships cite an old treaty from 1846, the Bidlack-Mallarino Treaty. This was a treaty between the United States and Colombia designed decades earlier to guarantee that the United States had the right to maintain free transit across the Panamanian Railroad.
Wait, so they took a treaty that was originally designed to protect the railroad from, bandits, and used it against the host country itself.
That is exactly what they did. The American naval commanders essentially informed the Colombian generals, look, if your troops disembark and march on the rebels, it will cause fighting. Fighting will disrupt the transit of the railroad. Under the 1846 treaty, we are obligated to keep the transit open. Therefore, we absolutely cannot allow your sovereign army to land on your own sovereign soil to put down a rebellion.
That is just breathtaking audacity. They legally paralyzed the Colombian army using their own treaty against them.
It was a practically bloodless revolution, largely because the Colombian troops literally couldn't get to the fight.
Unbelievable.
Days later, the United States formally recognized the newly minted Republic of Panama, and immediately Bunavarilla, who had very conveniently gotten himself appointed as Panama's ambassador to the United States, signed a new treaty.
Of course he did.
This treaty gave the United States a 10-mile-wide canal zone in perpetuity with complete sovereign rights over that zone.
Okay, I have to stop here and just ask about the underlying mindset. Because did the United States government The politicians, the public, genuinely believed they had the legal and moral right to just carve a transit zone out of another country entirely against its will? Or was it just, pure cynical power politics?
Well, it was certainly power politics, but they absolutely cloaked it in a very specific legal and moral justification. The sources highlight a truly shocking diplomatic concept that was heavily promoted at the time, particularly by politicians like Senator Shelby Cullom. It was called the international right of eminent domain.
Eminent domain, like when the local city government forces you to sell your house so they can widen a highway or build a mall.
Precisely like that, but applied on a planetary scale.
Wow.
The argument was that an Irmian Canal was a quote-unquote universal public utility. It was something that the entire commerce of the globe required to basically move humanity forward. Therefore, the argument went, Colombia's local petty sovereignty could not be allowed to stand in the way of global progress.
So it's framed as a duty.
Exactly. The United States framed itself as acting on behalf of civilization. If Colombia was going to be unreasonable and block this universal utility, the United States felt it had the right, even the solemn duty, to exercise global eminent domain and just seize the land for the greater good of the world.
So it wasn't just, we want this so we are taking it. It was, the world needs this, and we are the only ones capable of managing it, so you have to move out of the way.
Exactly.
And that mindset is crucial, because securing that canal zone was really only the beginning. Once you build this massive vital artery of global commerce, this totally new hemispheric jugular vein, you have to protect it. You just can't have instability anywhere near it. And that logic kicks off an entire era of intervention.
Yes. The moment the United States commits to the canal, the geography of the entire Caribbean basin changes in the eyes of Washington. Every single surrounding country suddenly becomes a potential threat to the approaches of the canal. So to protect this massive investment, the United States decided it had to establish absolute stability in the region. And this inaugurates the era heavily detailed in Musicant's book, commonly referred to as the Banana Wars.
Let's dive really deep into that, because Musicant details this whole cascade of early 20th century military and economic interventions across Central America and the Caribbean. And what's really fascinating is that the template for this actually started in Panama years before the canal was even built, right?
That's right. Let's go back to 1885 for a moment. Panama is still firmly part of Colombia. But remember that 1846 treaty giving the United States the right to keep the transit open.
Yeah, the one they used against the Colombians later.
Exactly. Well, in 1885, there is a massive rebellion in the Panamanian city of Colón, led by a man named Pedro Preston.
And the fighting gets so intense that Colón is essentially burned to the ground.
It's total chaos. And right in the middle of this burning city is the Panama Railroad, which is the vital artery connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The transit lines are completely threatened. So the United States intervenes. Commander Bowman Henry McCalla of the United States Navy arrives with a relatively small contingent of Marines and naval bluejackets.
And the tactics they use are just incredible to visualize. The text describes how they had to protect the trains moving through this incredibly dense jungle. So they essentially built makeshift armored flat cars.
It was highly pragmatic, totally improvised warfare. They took standard railroad flat cars, gathered heavy iron boiler plates, and literally bolted them around the edges to create a steel wall. Then they mounted Gatling guns and one-pounder cannons right on the train.
So you have these heavy steam trains rolling through the oppressive heat of the jungle, just bristling with rapid-fire weapons, essentially acting as mobile fortresses.
Yes. And they use these armored trains to forcefully push through the jungle, clear the tracks, and reestablish control over the railroad. They policed the transit area until Colombian forces could finally arrive and reassert their own authority.
Okay, so they held the line.
Right. Now, why does this matter? Because 1885 becomes the template. It proves to Washington that a relatively small, well-armed American force could intervene, stabilize the economic infrastructure, and dictate the terms of local conflicts to protect American interests.
But as we move into the early 1900s, the threats to the canal's approaches aren't just, local rebellions. The real fear in Washington is Europe.
Exactly. At the turn of the century, many Latin American nations, particularly in the Caribbean, had taken on massive amounts of debt from European banks to fund infrastructure or to fight internal wars.
Right.
And when these countries inevitably defaulted on those loans, European nations like Germany and Great Britain, they didn't just send angry letters, they sent warships.
Just straight to the gunboats.
Oh, yeah. They were perfectly willing to blockade ports or even bombard coastal cities to force repayment.
And if you are sitting in Washington looking at your shiny new multi-million-dollar canal project in Panama, the absolute last thing you want is the German Imperial Navy parking battleships right off the coast of the Dominican Republic to collect the debt.
Absolutely not. So President Theodore Roosevelt articulates a dramatic shift in foreign policy, which becomes known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
But let's clarify the original Monroe Doctrine first, just to make sure we're on the same page. That was essentially the United States putting up a massive keep-out sign in the Western Hemisphere, telling Europe that they could not colonize anywhere in the Americas anymore.
Correct. But the Roosevelt Corollary radically expanded that idea. Roosevelt declared that if a nation in the Western Hemisphere demonstrated chronic wrongdoing or an impotence that resulted in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, essentially, if they couldn't pay their bills or keep their government stable, it might ultimately require intervention. And since the Monroe Doctrine forbade European powers from intervening, Roosevelt argued that the United States itself would have to step in and exercise an international police power.
So let me make sure I understand this logic, because it's wild. The United States essentially steps in to act as a hemispheric collection agency. We decide that taking over a sovereign country's finances is the only way to keep foreign armies out of the American backyard.
That is exactly the mechanism. Look at the Dominican Republic, which Musicant covers. They were heavily in debt to European creditors. So, under the explicit justification of the Roosevelt Corollary, the United States literally sent officials, backed by the military, to seize control of the Dominican customs houses.
And back then, customs houses, the places that collect taxes on imported and exported goods at the ports, those are the primary source of revenue for these governments. There wasn't some massive internal income tax system like we have today.
Right. Whoever controlled the customs house controlled the nation's purse strings. So the United States military managed the customs receipts, skimmed off a large percentage to systematically pay off the European creditors, and handed the remainder to the local Dominican government to run the country. Wow. It was a profound structural violation of sovereignty, but completely justified in Washington by the pursuit of financial stability and the defense of the canal's broader perimeter.
But this policy of acting as an international police force inevitably drags the United States into grinding, brutal conflicts.
Yeah.
Because it isn't just accountants sitting in customs houses doing paperwork. It turns into deep, bloody jungle warfare.
Very much so. Let's look at Haiti. The United States occupation of Haiti lasted for 19 long years, from 1915 to 1934.
19 years.
Yes. It started ostensibly to stabilize the country and protect American economic interests, but it turned into a massive, protracted counterinsurgency campaign. Marines found themselves fighting deep in the mountainous jungles against fiercely independent Haitian guerrilla fighters known as the Cacos.
And the sources show how this warfare forced the United States military to rapidly evolve its tactics. The conflict in Nicaragua really stands out here. The United States intervened repeatedly there to prop up conservative governments that were friendly to American banking interests. And this sparked a massive resistance led by Augusto Cesar Sandino.
Sandino is a legendary historical figure. He led a fierce guerrilla war against the United States Marines and the American-trained Nicaraguan National Guard. And he was incredibly elusive.
Just a ghost in the jungle.
Pretty much. Yeah. He understood the terrain, he had immense local support, and he absolutely refused to fight pitched battles on the Marines' terms. The Marines were stretched incredibly thin across brutal, unforgiving terrain. So, to counter Sandino's mobility, the United States military had to rely on a brand new, rapidly evolving technology, aviation.
Musicant details this specific event, the Battle of Occital, which is just fascinating from a military history perspective. The Marines and local Allied forces were besieged in the town of Occital by a massive force of Sandino's rebels. They are totally outnumbered, they're running out of ammunition, and it really looks like they're going to be overrun.
And then Major Rusty Rowell leads a squadron of de Laviland biplanes into the fight. Now, keep in mind, these are open cockpit planes made of wood, canvas, and wire.
Right. These aren't modern jets. And what they execute over Occital is actually considered the first organized, strategic dive-bombing attack in military history.
Yeah, explain how they did it, because it wasn't like modern bombing at all.
Not at all. There were no computer bomb sites. The pilots literally had to dive their planes at a steep, screaming angle directly at the ground, pointing the physical nose of the plane at the target to aim.
Right.
They dropped 22-pound fragmentation bombs and just strafed the rebel lines with machine guns, pulling out of the dive at the very last second.
I mean, the physical toll on the pilots, the sheer terror on the ground, it must have been apocalyptic for the people experiencing it. The dive bombing completely broke the siege of Occidental. But strategically, it represents something huge. The Banana Wars were essentially the bloody laboratory where the United States Marine Corps developed modern counterinsurgency tactics, small wars doctrine, and the entire concept of close air support.
The scale of this quote-unquote quadrispheric empire they are building is just immense. From protecting a single train line in Panama with boilerplates in 1885 to developing dive bombing in Nicaragua in the 1920s, the tools of intervention are advancing at lightning speed.
Yeah, rapid evolution.
Which brings us to a massive leap forward in our timeline. We have established this long history, this deeply ingrained doctrine of intervention to protect the isthmus. So let's fast forward decades later to December of 1989, and we are going right back to the very place where this all started, Panama.
Operation Just Cause. This is a crucial moment for us to really compare and contrast the history based on the sources.
So let's set the stage. It is 1989. The Cold War is finally winding down. Panama is firmly under the control of Manuel Noriega, the de facto military dictator, and his organization, the Panamanian Defense Forces. And the situation has just deteriorated completely.
Right. For a long time, Noriega had been a highly valuable intelligence asset for the United States, helping to counter leftist movements in Central America.
A completely transactional relationship.
Exactly. But the relationship had fractured beyond repair. He was indicted on massive drug trafficking charges in the United States, and furthermore, there was a growing, palpable fear in Washington regarding the Panama Canal treaties.
The Carter Trio's treaties of 1979.
Exactly. Those treaties dictated the gradual handover of the canal's administration from the United States entirely to Panamanian control by the year 2000. Washington was looking at Noriega's regime, looking at the rampant corruption and the instability, and thinking, we absolutely cannot hand over the most strategic waterway in the hemisphere to this man.
The tension reaches a total boiling point. I mean, the Panamanian National Assembly actually passes a resolution declaring that a state of war exists with the United States. And then, the critical inciting incident happens.
On December 16, 1989, an off-duty United States Marine, Lieutenant Robert Paz, was driving with some friends. They were stopped at a checkpoint manned by soldiers of the Panamanian Defense Forces. A confrontation occurred, the car tried to flee, and the soldiers opened fire, killing Lieutenant Paz.
And to make matters even worse, a United States Navy officer and his wife, who just happened to witness the shooting, were detained, brutally interrogated, and physically assaulted. According to the historical record, this completely shifted the Pentagon's thinking.
It did. Up until that point, the military had been considering various covert options, perhaps a surgical strike or a quiet off-the-books operation to kidnap Noriega and extract him.
Keep a low profile.
Right. But the death of an American serviceman and the assault on the naval couple provided the definitive justification. The plan shifted from a covert snatch and grab to overt, massive military action.
So, if this banana war doctrine of intervention was established in the early 1900s, how did it hold up when military technology evolved? I mean, did we abandon the old playbook when we had stealth bombers instead of Gatling guns?
The underlying logic didn't change at all, actually, but the application of force became almost unrecognizable. If we contrast the military doctrine of 1989 with 1885, the difference is staggering.
How so?
Well, when Commander McCalla intervened in Panama in 1885, he landed a few hundred sailors, bolted some iron to a train, and achieved very limited, localized goals. Operation Just Cause, on the other hand, utilized overwhelming, simultaneous, massive force.
Overwhelming is honestly an understatement. The source material outlines the sheer scale of the invasion. 24,000 United States military personnel were involved. They didn't just land boats. They brought in the 18th Airborne Corps. They used Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Delta Force. They had the 82nd Airborne Division doing massive nighttime combat jumps directly onto Panamanian airfields. They even debuted the F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters.
It was a highly coordinated, simultaneous strike designed to completely paralyze and dismantle the entire Panamanian Defense Forces in a matter of hours, and to capture Noriega.
We went from a handful of sailors on a dock to dropping an entire airborne corps into a capital city. The tools changed completely. We traded boilerplates for stealth technology. But the geographical obsession, that absolute unyielding need to control the security of that transit zone, stayed exactly the same.
And crucially, the underlying legal and moral justifications remained nearly identical, protecting American citizens and ensuring the security of the Isthmian transit. The rhetoric used by President George H.W. Bush in 1989 to justify Operation Just Cause echoed the rhetoric of the Roosevelt Corollary from the turn of the century almost perfectly.
Okay, so we have thoroughly mapped out the physical, military, and economic consumption of Latin America based on the sources. We've talked about the extraction of resources, the policing of borders, the sheer kinetic force used to maintain this hemispheric system.
Right.
But here is where this deep dive takes a really unexpected and honestly fascinating turn. Because our sources, specifically the academic articles by Schuler and Adamark and the Guardian piece, they argue that this legacy of physical intervention didn't just end when the troops came home. It evolved. It morphed into something far more subtle in the 21st century. The cultural consumption of the jungle and its indigenous people.
This is a vital pivot. We are moving from the deployment of Marines to the deployment of cinematic narratives. And to do that, we have to look at the literary and cinematic trope known as the white man in the jungle.
Let's unpack that trope, because once you see it, it is literally everywhere. The Guardian article explains that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right around the exact same time the battleship Oregon was making its voyage, the jungle was viewed by Western audiences essentially the same way we view deep space today.
Yeah, the final frontier.
Exactly. It was a terrifying frontier. It was unfathomable, full of deadly diseases, and to the Western colonial mind, it was a place completely lacking in civilization.
It functioned as this blank canvas onto which European and American imperial powers could project their deepest anxieties, but also their wildest fantasies.
Right.
These ideas were heavily fueled by the sensationalized, often completely horrific tales of explorers in places like King Leopold II's Congo. The jungle was painted as an exotic nightmare, a place of primitive savagery, but simultaneously a place of vast, untapped resources just waiting to be extracted by modern industry.
And out of this specific historical mindset comes perhaps the ultimate defining example of this trope, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan.
Tarzan of the Apes is the classic foundational text for this argument. It was published in 1912, right at the height of this imperial era, and it is a story utterly steeped in the racial and eugenic theories of its time. You have a white man, an English aristocrat, Lord Greystoke, who is orphaned as a baby and dropped into the deepest, most savage jungle in Africa.
And what happens? He doesn't just survive. Thanks to his supposedly superior innate Anglo-Saxon genetics, he inevitably rises to become the absolute master of the environment.
Yep.
He teaches himself to read, he defeats the great apes, he becomes the king of the beasts, and eventually the natural ruler over the local indigenous people.
The implicit message of Tarzan is incredibly clear and deeply colonial. Put a white man of good breeding into the primitive wilderness, and his inherent racial superiority will naturally bring order to the chaos. He is the ultimate civilizing force, even when he is basically swinging from vines wearing a loincloth.
And that narrative framework, the white man entering the primitive zone, mastering its ways better than the natives, and usually saving it, it played out again and again in our culture. You see it in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, you see it in Dances with Wolves, and as our sources controversially argue, you see it all the way up to Sam Worthington's character in James Cameron's 2009 blockbuster, Avatar.
It's a very persistent narrative structure.
Okay, hold on, I need to stop right here.
Yeah.
Because my immediate instinct is to reject that comparison completely.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Because Avatar is globally famous for being aggressively anti-military and anti-corporate. It's essentially a giant 3-hour critique of the exact historical interventionists we just spent the first half of this deep dive talking about. The villains in Avatar are greedy corporate mercenaries strip mining the planet Pandora. So how do these academic sources justify putting James Cameron's supposedly progressive environmental message in the exact same colonial box as a blatantly racist myth like Tarzan?
It is a brilliant point of friction, and it is the central paradox our academic sources are really trying to untangle. The critique by scholars like Schuler and Adamark centers not on the film's explicit, surface-level anti-corporate message. They fully acknowledge that Cameron is trying to criticize imperialism.
Okay.
But they argue that how the film achieves its emotional impact, and specifically how it utilizes its indigenous characters to do so, relies on the exact same colonial architecture as the older myths.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that. How does an anti-imperialist movie end up being colonial?
Kyla Schuller's article introduces a crucial historical concept: sentimentalism. She describes it as an aesthetic and literary mode that became massively popular in the 19th century, right alongside the massive expansion of empires. Think of books like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Sentimental literature was specifically designed to make the privileged reader deeply feel the pain and suffering of marginalized, often enslaved or indigenous people.
Which sounds like a good thing, right? I mean, using empathy to make people care about injustice.
Yeah. The goal was often progressive, yes. The idea was that by shedding tears over the suffering of the oppressed, the reader would become a better, more moral, more enlightened person. But Schiller points out the trap. The marginalized person's suffering is essentially commodified.
Commodified? How?
It is consumed by the privileged reader for their own emotional growth. The suffering happens so the white reader can feel good about feeling bad.
Oh, wow. So empathy is a tool for self-improvement rather than actual systemic change.
Exactly. Now, Schiller argues that modern blockbuster filmmaking, and Avatar specifically, is a neoliberal 21st century iteration of this exact same sentimentalism.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around that. How does a movie with giant blue aliens fit into 19th century sentimentalism?
It comes down to the technology. Modern filmmakers use incredibly advanced computer-generated imagery and 3D technology to create what Schiller calls effective encounters. The technology in Avatar was revolutionary because it captured the minute micro-expressions of the human actors and translated them flawlessly onto the digital faces of the Na'vi. It perfectly isolates and amplifies emotional movements.
Think about the last time you sat in a theater with 3D glasses on, watching Jake Sully learn to fly a Banshee. You felt that visceral rush of wind, right? You felt the direct bodily connection to the screen.
Yes. The technology basically bypasses your intellect and hits your nervous system directly. This allows the viewer in the movie theater to safely consume the jungle experience. They can physically feel the emotional movements of these racialized indigenous bodies on screen. They can feel the thrill of the hunt, the absolute tragedy of the destruction of the home tree.
Right.
But they do it in a completely sanitized environment.
It is the consumption of the exotic experience, perfectly packaged for late capitalism. You get the emotional high, the moral cleansing of being one with nature and fighting the bad guys, without having to actually dismantle the systems of power that afford you the movie ticket in the first place.
Precisely. And this theory ties directly into the plot mechanism of Avatar, which the other scholar, John Adamar, calls the conversion tale.
Let's look really closely at Jake Sully, the protagonist of Avatar. He is a former Marine, but he is paralyzed from the waist down.
That physical paralysis is highly symbolic in the framework of the conversion tale. Jake represents a toxic, over-civilized, militaristic, and fundamentally broken modern world. The industrialized Earth has literally broken his body, just as it has broken the planet's ecosystem.
So he goes to the planet Pandora, and he uses the Avatar technology to transition his human consciousness into the body of a native Na'vi.
And here's the crucial part of the conversion narrative. By becoming indigenous, by completely abandoning his civilized human self and fully embracing the tribal lifestyle of the Na'vi, his broken body is healed. He can walk again. He can run. He is quite literally saved by adopting the identity of the noble savage.
So going back to my pushback earlier, why is this like Tarzan?
Yeah.
The answer is that the indigenous people in these stories, the Na'vi, are not really treated as complex, modern equals with their own agency. They exist primarily as a pure, untouched resource. They are basically a spiritual medicine that the white protagonist consumes to heal his own brokenness and find his own moral redemption.
Yes. They function as a plot device for the salvation of the white hero. They're entirely isolated from modern history. They live in perfect static harmony with nature, seemingly frozen in a prehistoric past. They are just the backdrop for Jake Sully's journey to become their ultimate leader, the Toruk Makto, just like Lord Greystoke mastering the jungle.
Which brings us to the most fascinating and perhaps the most disturbing part of this deep dive, how this cinematic trope doesn't just stay in the movie theater. It actually bleeds back into real-world environmentalism.
The White Messiah fable has very tangible consequences. Adam Mark's article details how James Cameron took the massive success and the narrative framework of Avatar and applied it directly to real-world activism in the Amazon rainforest.
Right. Explain what happened there. Because Cameron became heavily involved in the protests against the building of the Belo Monte hydroelectric dam on the Xingu River in Brazil.
The Belamonte Dam was a massive, highly controversial infrastructure project that threatened to displace indigenous tribes and flood vast areas of the rainforest. Cameron went down there, met with indigenous leaders, and even made a short documentary about the struggle called A Message from Pandora.
And in doing so, the lines between the cinematic fiction of Pandora and the real-world indigenous struggle in the Amazon became incredibly strangely blurred.
Very blurred. The sources note that actors from Avatar, including Sigourney Weaver and Joel Moore, traveled to the Amazon to protest alongside Cameron. Edemark argues they acted almost as meta-avatars.
Meta-avatar.
Yeah, because they played the sympathetic, good white people in the movie, they brought the symbolic weight and the moral authority of their fictional characters directly into the complex, real-world political conflict of Brazil.
Edemark actually compares this to an older film from 1985, John Boorman's movie The Emerald Forest, which coincidentally was also filmed in the exact same Xingu region of Brazil. In that movie, a white engineer's son is kidnapped by an isolated indigenous tribe. He grows up as one of them, fully integrating into their culture. And eventually, the white father and the converted white son have to team up to literally blow up a hydroelectric dam to save the tribe's pristine forest.
It is the exact same conversion narrative repeated decades apart. The white hero must convert to a tribal, pre-industrial lifestyle to gain the moral purity required to save the environment from techno-industrial modernization.
So, pulling all these threads together, what does this actually mean for how the modern Western world views indigenous cultures today?
The sources synthesize this into a really profound and quite troubling paradox. Modern Western environmentalism often relies heavily on the image of the ecological rainforest Indian. We depict indigenous people as living in an absolute, untainted, mystical harmony with nature.
Which, again, seems like a positive stereotype on the surface, right?
Yeah.
We're praising their wisdom, holding them up as the ideal way to live on a fragile planet.
It seems positive, but it is actually a trap. It denies them complexity and modernity. The disturbing irony highlighted by the sources is that the West, the industrialized world that has historically created the massive climate crisis through a century of extraction, now uses this image of the pure ecological native to save itself from its own overwhelming climate guilt.
It is an exportation of the problem.
Exactly. We effectively export the burden of ecological salvation to indigenous bodies in other places. The subtext of these narratives is that we demand they remain in the jungle, untouched by modernity, serving as the mystical guardians of the Earth's lungs.
It is like a tech support hotline, but with terrible conditions. The industrialized world broke the planetary server. Now, we are treating indigenous cultures like the mystical information technology department, begging them to fix it for us.
Exactly. But a tech support hotline where we refuse to let the IT guy use a modern computer, we demand they fix our servers using a stone tablet.
Right. The condition for our admiration is that they remain completely disconnected from the modern world. They aren't allowed to want smartphones or modern hospitals or paved roads or economic development. They have to stay the noble savage frozen in time so we can continue our modern, carbon-heavy lifestyles in the West and still feel a little bit better about ourselves.
That is the ultimate stinging critique presented by these sources. If you look at the entire arc of this deep dive, the physical extraction of resources from Latin America, the coal burned by the Oregon, the agricultural control during the Banana Wars, the military dominance of the transit lines has arguably been replaced, or at least heavily augmented, by the emotional and moral extraction of indigenous identities today. We consume their perceived purity through 3D glasses to heal our own civilized malaise.
That is a tremendous amount of history and theory to process.
Yeah.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started in 1898, deep inside the frantic, desperately hot, cold-choked 66-day voyage of the battleship Oregon. We saw how the terror of that journey made the Panama Canal an absolute strategic imperative for the United States. We mapped how that geographical necessity, the need to protect the approaches to the canal, led to a sweeping doctrine of intervention. We unpacked the Roosevelt Corollary, the customs receiverships, and decades of grueling jungle warfare across Central America and the Caribbean, from the armored trains of Panama to the dive-bombing biplanes of Nicaragua.
We traced that military lineage all the way forward to the massive, overwhelming force of Operation Just Cause in 1989. We saw how the technological tools of empire changed from Gatling guns to stealth fighters, but the fundamental underlying need to control the geopolitical choke points of the hemisphere remained completely identical.
And then we crossed over the boundary from military history into the realm of culture. We examined how the historical reality of the white man in the jungle was translated, sanitized, and packaged into sentimental neocolonial cinema. We followed the thread from the overtly racial hierarchies of Tarzan mastering the wild, all the way to Avatar's Jake Sully consuming the indigenous experience to heal his broken modern soul. We looked at how Hollywood blockbusters and real-world environmental campaigns continue to commodify the jungle and its inhabitants, turning them into isolated, mystical resources meant to save the West from its own destructive history.
It is a continuous, unbroken narrative of consumption. The only thing that shifts is the medium, from the physical extraction of the land to the digital and emotional extraction of the culture.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to really mull over the next time you sit down in a dark movie theater, put on those 3D glasses, or read an article about saving the rainforest.
If our most popular, critically acclaimed modern narratives about fighting imperialism and saving the environment still fundamentally rely on 19th century colonial stereotypes of the noble savage to make us care, let me rephrase that. If they still rely on those stereotypes, are we actually dismantling the empire, or are we simply updating its operating system for the digital age?
It really makes you rethink who is actually being saved when we watch these stories unfold. Thank you for joining us on this journey. I encourage you to keep questioning the historical narratives hiding right beneath the surface of the entertainment you consume. Until next time, keep diving deep.